You healed. You did the work. You faced the darkest parts of yourself, the shame, the rage, the grief you had been carrying for other people your entire life. And then something strange happened. The people around you started to disappear. The friendships that once felt permanent started to feel hollow. Family dinners became exhausting. The conversations that used to feel normal now felt like someone was asking you to wear a coat that no longer fits. If that is where you are right now, this video is for you. Because what happened to you was not a tragedy. It was not a sign that something went wrong. Carl Jung spent decades studying the deep psychology underneath this exact experience, and what he observed changes everything about how you see the loneliness you are feeling right now. That isolation is not the end of your story. According to Jung, it is the gateway. It is the first step into a terrifyingly powerful new stage of existence. And once you understand what that stage looks like, you will never be afraid of the silence again. Let's start with why the separation happened in the first place. When an empath, a term Jung never used himself, but which modern psychology applies to what he called the introverted intuitive type, begins the process of shadow integration, when they stop running from their own anger, their own darkness, their own needs, something fundamental shifts in how they show up in the world. For years, these individuals had served a very specific function inside their social systems. This is what modern psychologists might call being emotional shock absorbers, a role Jung described more precisely as carrying the unconscious burden of the group. They were the ones who smoothed things over, who kept the peace, who absorbed the tension in the room so that everyone else could stay comfortable. The people around them, whether they knew it consciously or not, had built their entire relationship on that function. So when the empath stops absorbing, when they start setting limits and speaking truth and refusing to pretend everything is fine, the ecosystem collapses. The toxic people leave first, and they leave loudly. They call the empath selfish, cold, changed for the worse. They say things like, "I don't know who you are anymore." What they mean, underneath all of that, is something far more honest. They mean, "You are no longer useful to me in the way you used to be." This is what Jung observed in the broader patterns of individuation he documented across his clinical practice. The moment a person stops being a vessel for other people's unprocessed emotions, those people find somewhere else to pour them. The separation is not personal, it is structural. But even knowing that, it still hurts, because the empath is not losing toxic strangers. They are often losing the people they have loved the longest. And that brings us to the second part of the separation that nobody talks about. It is not just that toxic people leave. It is that neutral people become exhausting. Old friends who are not bad people, who have never hurt you deliberately, suddenly feel like a weight. The conversations feel shallow. What Jung described as a divergence in consciousness has quietly opened between you. The empath has changed. The other person has not, and neither one is wrong. But the space between them has quietly become enormous. The empath now sees things in conversation that they cannot unsee. They notice the micro-expressions. They feel the unexpressed resentment under a smile. They sense the desperation beneath a confident presentation. And they are exhausted by the effort it takes to pretend they do not see any of it, just to make social interaction feel normal. Jung warned about the isolation that comes with what he called differentiation, the process by which one psychological function becomes highly developed while the person's social environment remains unchanged. When your greatest psychological strength, in this case the deep perceptual and emotional intelligence of the highly sensitive person, becomes more developed than the relationships around you can hold, it creates a painful gap, not a gap of arrogance, a gap of lonely clarity. Consider the composite profile Jung documented across the cases he observed most closely. The pattern that repeated across highly sensitive individuals at this exact stage of growth. The empath finds themselves sitting in a conversation they used to enjoy with a person they genuinely care about, feeling completely alone. Not because anything dramatic happened, simply because the depth at which they are now living has no counterpart in the room. They smile and they answer questions, and they go home and feel more isolated than they did before they left the house. That experience is not a sign that you have become cold. It is a sign that you have become conscious. This is where most people make one of two mistakes, and understanding those mistakes is what determines everything that comes next. The first thing people do when they enter this gap is panic. They ask themselves the question that every awakening empath eventually asks. Am I the problem? Have I become the narcissist? Is my growth just a story I'm telling myself to justify pushing everyone away? This question is actually a healthy sign. Real narcissists do not ask it, but it deserves a real answer. Jung described a phase in the individuation process that he called the night sea journey, drawing from an ancient mythological image of the hero swallowed by a great fish, moving through darkness beneath the surface of the world. In modern psychological terms, many practitioners and researchers familiar with Jung's model refer to this phase as the incubation period, the time when the old self has dissolved and the new self has not yet fully formed. During this phase, the empath retreats. They stop initiating. They spend more time alone than they ever have in their lives. They cancel plans. They sit with silence in a way that used to terrify them. From the outside, it looks like depression. From the inside, it feels like decompression. Jung identified this not as a breakdown, but as a necessary sanctuary. Consider the composite profile he documented across numerous cases, the pattern he saw repeat in highly sensitive individuals undergoing integration. The empath who, after years of absorbing everyone else's emotional residue, finally enters a period of deliberate solitude. Not isolation born of despair, but isolation as detoxification. The nervous system, which has been running on high alert for decades, finally gets permission to rest. The emotional body, which has been carrying feelings that never belonged to it, slowly begins to sort through what is truly its own. This is not a sign of regression. This is the immune system of the psyche doing its most important work. The danger in this phase is not the solitude itself. The danger is the voice that says the solitude is wrong. The voice that says you need to be more social, you are being selfish, you used to be so warm, and now you are cold. That voice, more often than not, belongs to the people who benefited most from you not having limits. There is something important to understand about that voice. It is not always coming from bad people. Sometimes it is coming from people who are genuinely scared, who watched you change and felt the ground shift under their feet, who do not have the psychological framework to understand that your growth is not an attack on them, even though it changes everything about the dynamic between you. Whether the voice comes from manipulation or fear, the answer is the same. This phase cannot be rushed. It takes the time it takes. Fighting it to stay socially acceptable will only extend it. Ignore that voice. The hermit phase is not the destination, but it is a required stop on the journey. Now, here is where the real danger enters the picture, because the hermit phase is uncomfortable, because loneliness has a weight to it, because the human need for connection is deep and real. There is an enormous temptation during this period to go back to sleep, to reach out to the old group, to shrink back down to the version of yourself that people were comfortable with, to carry the unconscious burden of the group again, just so you can feel like you belong somewhere. And this is where Jung issued his most serious warning. Once you have integrated a part of your shadow, once you have truly seen it and claimed it as your own, you cannot put that awareness back in the box. Going back is not neutral. It does not return you to where you were. It creates a split in the psyche, a fracture between what you now know to be true and the performance of a self you have already outgrown. Jung documented the broader pattern across his observations of patients who attempted this regression. They experience severe psychological consequences, not because growth is punishing, but because the psyche, once it has moved toward wholeness, experiences the retreat as a form of violence against itself. Think of it this way. You cannot unknow what you know. You can choose not to act on it. You can choose to stay silent. But the awareness is permanent. And every time you perform unconsciousness to make someone else comfortable, you pay a psychological price. The cost compounds. First, it is mild irritability. Then it is a slow sense of emptiness. Then it is a resentment so deep that even you cannot explain where it came from. And eventually it becomes the very breakdown you were trying to avoid by going back. There is a particular kind of grief that comes with understanding this, because it would be so much easier if going back were an option. If the empath could just return to who they were before, slip back into the familiar patterns and feel the warmth of belonging again. But that switch does not exist. The awareness, once developed, is load-bearing. And the moment you try to dismantle it to make someone else comfortable, you're not just being kind. You are abandoning yourself at the foundation level. Jung was direct about this in his broader observations of the individuation process. The psyche does not experience the return to unconsciousness as rest. It experiences it as betrayal. And the empath, who has spent an entire lifetime betraying themselves in service of others, finally reaches a point where the psyche refuses to absorb that betrayal any further. The path forward is not back, even when back feels warm and familiar and safe. So what does the path forward actually look like? This is where Jung's work becomes genuinely exciting, because what emerges on the other side of the hermit phase is not the person who went in. Something new has formed in the quiet. The empath who enters the sanctuary as a wounded healer emerges as someone who sees lies, manipulation, and hidden emotional pain almost instantly, but who no longer feels destroyed by what they see. The difference between the awakened empath before integration and after integration is enormous. Before, they saw everything, felt everything, absorbed everything, and could not stop it. Their gift was also their wound. They walked into rooms and became sponges for whatever the room was carrying. They could feel someone's grief from across a dinner table and spend the next 3 days not knowing why they felt so heavy. After, the sight is still there. The perception is still there. In fact, it becomes even sharper. But the boundary between what they feel and what belongs to them becomes clear. They can perceive another person's pain without fusing with it. They can see the manipulation in a conversation without being destabilized by it. They can read the room and then choose how and whether to respond. This is what Jung meant when he described the completion of shadow integration. The empath moves from being a receiver with no volume control to being a conscious operator of a genuinely extraordinary instrument. They are no longer just nice. They become something far more powerful. They become kind with clarity, warm with precision. They can be moved by genuine emotion and completely unmoved by performance. The people who used to be able to make them doubt their own perception by simply insisting loudly enough find that this no longer works. The awakened empath does not need external validation to trust what they see, because they have done the internal work to know the difference between their projections and their genuine perception. Jung described this as one of the rarest developments a human being can undergo. A person who feels deeply and sees clearly at the same time. Not feeling at the expense of clarity, not clarity at the expense of feeling. Both, fully, simultaneously. This is the essence of what Jung called individuation, a state of true psychological autonomy where the person has become an indivisible unity, a self that is no longer assembled from other people's needs and expectations. And it has a very specific effect on the people around the awakened empath. The ones who operated through subtle manipulation, who relied on the empath's people-pleasing to keep their behavior unchallenged, begin to feel deeply uncomfortable, not because the empath has become aggressive, but because the performance no longer lands. The flattery that once worked does not produce the old reaction. The guilt trip that once caused an immediate apology now meets a calm, steady silence. The awakened empath does not announce the change. They simply stop participating in the old script. And for people who depended on that script, the absence feels like a threat. This is the last piece of the social shedding. Not just the people who openly drained you, also the people who had quietly depended on your unconsciousness to keep their own behavior invisible. Now this new state changes something fundamental about how the awakened empath needs to approach the question of connection. The old longing was for belonging, for being accepted into a group and finally feeling like you fit. The empath before integration often built their entire identity around being needed, being the helper, the listener, the one who kept everything together. Their relationships were built on that function. But now, the function has changed. The empath is no longer looking for a place where their performance is accepted. They are looking for something rarer and more specific. They are looking for contact, real contact, the experience of being truly seen by someone who can hold what they see without flinching. Jung emphasized, across his later writings on individuation, the vital importance of the rare relationships that can actually hold psychological truth without collapsing under its weight. Not a replacement social group, not a new set of people to people please. A small number of genuine connections built on honesty rather than mutual comfort. Research on psychological intimacy, drawing from decades of work by developmental psychologists and attachment theorists, consistently shows what Jung observed in his clinical work. The number of deep connections a person can sustain is small, but the quality of those connections determines everything about psychological well-being. The shift from seeking quantity to seeking quality is not a sign of becoming antisocial. It is a sign of becoming honest about what you actually need. The awakened empath begins to find these few through a recognizable process. They stop performing and start being. They say true things in conversation and notice who leans in and who pulls back. They express a real opinion and notice who can engage with it and who needs them to take it back. They show a genuine edge, a moment of honest disagreement or real feeling, and they notice who trusts them more for it and who becomes uncomfortable. The few who understand reveal themselves through their response to authenticity. They are not necessarily people who have everything figured out. They are people who are in honest relationship with their own inner life. They have done or are doing their own work. They can sit with complexity without needing to resolve it. They can hear hard things without needing to defend against them. Jung described a specific quality that these individuals share. He called it psychological mindedness, a genuine curiosity about inner experience, about what drives behavior, about why people do what they do. You can test for it simply. Bring something real into a conversation. Not dramatic, just true. And notice whether the other person meets it with genuine curiosity or quickly redirects to something more comfortable. The people who meet truth with curiosity are the ones worth investing in. When the awakened empath finds even one of these people, something that had been quietly aching for years begins to settle. This brings us to the deepest realization in everything Jung wrote about this process, and the one that reframes the entire journey from the beginning. The loneliness you experienced was not an accident. It was not proof of your brokenness or your unlovability, or some fundamental flaw in your character. It was the price of admission. Jung believed that individuals who undergo genuine individuation, who face their shadow and integrate it, who develop real psychological depth, serve a function in the larger human story that goes beyond their personal lives. Jung referred to such people as those carrying what he called the transcendent function, a bridge between the conscious and the unconscious that the collective as a whole could not yet build for itself. In modern terms, we might call them culture carriers, people who hold a kind of awareness the collective is not yet ready to bear, and who, by living it consciously, make it more available to everyone around them. This lines up with what researchers like Dr. Elaine Aron documented in her work on highly sensitive persons. Approximately 20% of the population processes experience at a neurological depth that the other 80% does not. These individuals often feel out of place, not because they are broken, but because they are processing more information than the average social environment is designed to accommodate. Jung saw this same phenomenon through a psychological lens and went further, arguing that these individuals are not misfits but advanced scouts, people whose inner development precedes the collective's readiness for it. The empath who outgrows their old life is not falling behind. They are moving ahead of the timeline their old environment was running on. The isolation was necessary because you cannot shed a skin while still inside the old one. The people who left had to leave because the relationship was built on a version of you that no longer exists. The silence had to be entered because the noise was covering something important that needed to be heard. And the remarkable thing is that this is not a new story. Across the history of human experience, across every culture that has produced a record of inner life, there is an account of the person who went through the fire and came out different, who spent a period in the wilderness, literal or metaphorical, and returned with something that could not have been found in the crowd. The mystics called it the dark night of the soul. Depth psychologists call it individuation. The awakened empath experiences it as the worst and most important period of their life simultaneously. What Jung understood is that the individual who does this work is not doing it only for themselves. When a person becomes more conscious, when they integrate their shadow and develop genuine self-knowledge, they change the atmosphere in every room they enter. They model something for the people around them without trying to, without preaching, simply by being more real than they used to be. Some people will run from it, but some people will feel, for the first time in a long time, that it is safe to be honest. That, in Jung's framework, is the transcendent function made visible in a human life, not teaching, not leading, simply embodying a more integrated way of being. And all of it, every painful moment of it, was moving you towards something that most people never reach, a self that is entirely your own, not a performance crafted for approval, not a role assigned by family or culture or the needs of the people around you. An actual self, specific, grounded, clear. Jung wrote that the highest form of loneliness is not being surrounded by people who do not see you. It is not yet knowing yourself well enough to be seen accurately. The hermit phase resolves the second kind, and once it does, the first kind becomes temporary. You did not lose your people, you lost your old role, and those are not the same thing. The friendships that dissolved were not proof that you are unlovable. They were proof that the relationship had been built on something that healing could not survive. The family members who pulled away were not rejecting you. They were rejecting the mirror. They were rejecting the discomfort of being around someone who was no longer willing to pretend that the unspoken things were not there. What fills the void that they leave is not a replacement cast. It is you. The version of you that exists when no one is watching and no one needs anything and you are not managing anyone else's emotional state. That self, once you have spent enough time in its company, becomes the most stable relationship you have ever had. And from that stability, the few genuine connections become possible. Because you are no longer bringing a wound to every relationship and hoping someone will fix it. You are bringing a whole person, imperfect, still growing, still figuring things out, but fundamentally intact. That is what makes real connection possible, not need. Wholeness meeting wholeness. Jung captured it precisely in his concept of individuation. The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. Not who your parents needed you to be, not who your partner is comfortable with, not who the group rewards for making things easier, who you actually are. That becoming is what this entire journey has been about. The broken victim who absorbed everyone's pain, the isolated hermit who sat in the quiet and let the old self dissolve, the individuated person who sees clearly, feels deeply, and cannot be manipulated back into unconsciousness. That arc is not a tragedy, that arc is a transformation, and the fact that you are here, watching this, asking these questions, sitting with this discomfort instead of running from it, means you are somewhere inside that arc right now. You are not lost, you are in process, and that is the most honest thing anyone can say about the journey you are on. You have not been abandoned, you have been promoted.